The day I received the letter from the High Maple Acres Homeowners Association, I remember thinking it had to be some kind of joke, a bad one. I'd been living in this neighborhood for nearly 15 years, always paid my dues, always kept my yard tidy, and had only one modest desire. I wanted to build a small tree house in my old oak for my grandson, Oliver. Where was the harm in that? I still recall the envelope's crisp edges, how the bright white paper nearly glowed in the afternoon light. It looked so official. There it was, printed in bold Times New Roman type. Under no circumstances may any structure, attached or otherwise, be built on your property outside of standard guidelines. Then came the specifics referencing the giant oak in my backyard. They'd apparently obtained photographic evidence of me measuring the branches. This one rule, the no treehouse clause, felt like the final straw in a pile of petty dictates I'd endured for too long. I tolerated them fining me for leaving my garbage bin out an hour too late on trash night. I'd swallowed the frustration when they disallowed the color of shutters I liked, stating it was too garish. I'd accepted it all, telling myself the HOA kept the neighborhood looking nice and that it was worth a few inconveniences. But telling me I couldn't build a small, harmless treehouse? I wasn't building a theme park. It was a humble, four-walled platform, little more than a raised porch in the branches. Or so I'd planned, before the letter arrived. That evening, I sat on my porch with my wife, Cynthia, sipping on sweet tea. We had no fence dividing our yard from the huge oak, letting the old trunks serve as a centerpiece of the lawn. As dusk settled, I listened to the crickets and replayed every conversation with Oliver about Grandpa's big oak adventure. "He's only 10, Cynthia said gently, resting her hand on mine. "There's time to figure it out in some other way." I nodded, though my pride was pricked. Oliver lived 3 states away, and our grand visits were the highlight of my retirement. I was healthy, still agile for my age, and building a treehouse felt like breathing life back into my own childhood daydreams. I remember how, as a boy, I used to climb my grandfather's elm tree with just a few random planks hammered into the trunk as steps. Tree kingdoms, we called it. We'd spend hours there imagining we were explorers in a foreign land. I wanted Oliver to have something similar, to feel that same sense of wonder you can only find in a place set apart from everyday life, even if that place is only 10 feet off the ground. I noticed the letter still in my hand, the words blending into the night. I read it again. The fine print threatened something like $100 a day if I proceeded with any structure. $100 a day. That was no small fee. Yet something about that threat only fueled a spark inside me. We'll see about that, I thought. I might have let it go had it been just a single outraged official, or if I'd felt the rule was truly about safety. But I knew the HOA board members by name. Some of them were nice enough, but there were a couple who reveled in delivering these notices. It was less about the well-being of the neighborhood and more about maintaining control. The retired lawyer on the board, a fellow named Martin, who made it his mission to interpret bylaws so strictly that even an extra garden gnome could be seen as contraband. In that orchard fiasco last year, he insisted I uproot the cluster of peach trees behind the garage because they drew fruit flies. Hogwash. 1 or 2 neighbors had told me in hushed tones they'd quietly support a treehouse if I built it, but nobody wanted to get on the HOA's bad side. You might think a treehouse is minor, but in High Maple Acres, stepping out of line could mean endless inspections, fines, letters, and general hostility. No one wanted that headache. The more I pondered, the stronger my resolve became. It was no longer just about a child's play fort. It was about reclaiming some independence, about telling the stuffed shirts, "You don't decide my entire life." And it was about proving to Oliver that adults could still be adventurous and fearless. And so, by the time I went to bed that night, I'd hatched my plan. Not only would I build a treehouse, I'd make something grand, bigger, bolder, more magnificent than anything the HOA could imagine. Something so substantial that it would become impossible to ignore and even harder to bring down. Just a few hours after sunrise, I hopped on the phone to call my longtime friend Bob. He was a retired contractor with a bit of a mischievous side. If anyone would know how to do this right, it was him. I told him my idea in broad strokes. I don't want just a glorified fort. I want something stunning. A real treehouse paradise. On the other end of the line, Bob let out a low whistle. You know the HOA is going to flip their lids, right? That they will, I said, feeling my heart drumming in my chest. But let's make sure they'll have to try awfully hard to tear it down. It was a defiant move, borderline foolish. But I was determined. There are moments in life when you choose between playing it safe or standing up for something that means more to you than a rule on a piece of paper. This was one of those moments. I set aside the letter and replaced it in my mind with blueprints of a magnificent treehouse. That was the exact moment I decided. If the HOA wanted to ban a simple treehouse, I was going to build them something they'd never forget. 2 weeks later, Bob and I were perched on my back porch, deep in conversation about beams, joists, and how to navigate around the massive trunk of the oak. By now, the idea had ballooned from a basic four-walled hut to a multi-level structure with a small deck, a hidden reading nook, and maybe even a winding ramp reminiscent of a fantasy tree village. My wife hovered near the screen door, occasionally interjecting with practical concerns. If you make it too high, she warned, you'll risk your own safety. You're not 18 anymore. She used that motherly tone, even though we were both pushing our mid-60s. Bob responded with a twinkle in his eye. We're still spry enough to climb a tree, Synth. And if we do it right, it'll be safe as houses. We pored over the plans in secret. It felt a bit thrilling. Bob brought his experience from decades of building everything from custom decks to entire cabins. I contributed the vision. I wanted a place for my grandson to explore, for me to meditate with a cup of coffee, and maybe even enough space for a small group of neighbors to hang out, if they had the courage to defy the HOA and ascend the ladder. The blueprint was ambitious. We planned to anchor strong wooden supports around the trunk, distributing weight so the tree itself wouldn't be damaged. The platform would be about 10 feet off the ground, with a second level perched about 5 feet higher. A rope ladder and a small staircase at the back would provide entry. And yes, a crow's nest near the top branches, my personal indulgence. Logistics came next. We needed lumber, lots of it, and we wanted to do it quietly enough not to alert Martin from the HOA, who prowled the neighborhood like a hawk. The last thing we needed was him showing up at dawn with a camera. The neighbor behind me, Clara, offered to let us store some of the lumber in her shed, hidden behind a row of thick bushes. She had her own run-ins with the HOA, mostly about garden ornaments she refused to remove from her front yard. She offered the extra space, her eyes gleaming with the same mischievous enthusiasm as Bob's. "You be careful," Clara said, passing me a glass of lemonade. "But don't let those busybodies push you around. This is your property. That's your tree." She lowered her voice, as if the maples themselves might be bugged. "I just hate to see them come down on you like they did me." It was well known that once the HOA had a target, they'd escalate over the smallest things. Check for code infractions, photograph your yard, question the color of your mailbox. They had a real knack for making life miserable. But in that moment, seeing the supportive gleam in Clara's eyes, I felt emboldened. Together, Bob and I started building in earnest. We did it slowly at first, often in the early morning or late afternoon, when most of the neighborhood was inside. We parked Bob's beat-up truck by Clara's yard, carrying in beams, boards, nails, and tarps under the cover of dusk. Once we had enough materials in place, we'd start the actual construction at the oak itself. I distinctly remember the first evening we hammered in the main support beams. My arms quivered at the effort, but there was something deeply satisfying in physically establishing the foundation of my rebellion. When I ran my hand over the newly affixed wooden beam, pressed snug around the oak, it felt as though I were forging a bond with that tree, one that I'd longed for since childhood. Of course, it didn't take long for rumors to start swirling. Word travels quickly in high maple acres. One day, I was hauling a fresh stack of cedar planks when my neighbor, Ray, leaned over the fence and whispered, "Buddy, you sure you want to do this? I heard the board's got eyes on you." I gave him a tired smile. "I appreciate your concern, Ray, but I'm too far along to quit." The following morning, Bob and I noticed footprints in the dirt beneath the oak, not matching our boots. Someone had come by in the night, possibly snooping, possibly snapping pictures. I felt a tightening in my chest as I surveyed the ground. But it was also a clear sign that we had to pick up the pace if we were to stand a chance of completing this project before the HOA took official action. We pressed on, adding the floor joists and the frame for what would be the lower platform. The structure began to take shape, an emerging oasis hidden among leaves and branches. And with every slam of the hammer, every squeak of the drill, we were closer to finishing something magical, and in the thick of a growing storm. Sure enough, a few days later, I got a second letter. This time, it was more direct. We have reason to believe you are constructing an unauthorized structure in your backyard. Cease immediately or face further penalties, including daily fines and potential legal action. A rather stern, cold threat. My eyes flicked across the page, but unlike the first letter, I felt no surge of dread, only a steely determination. That afternoon, I tucked the letter into a drawer. Then I wiped the sweat from my brow, took a swig of water, and got back to work. Let them come and see what I was up to. By the time they realized the scope of this structure, it would be far too impressive to tear down without causing a monstrous uproar in the neighborhood. This treehouse wouldn't just be a child's nook in the leaves. It would be a testament to perseverance, a shining statement that not everything in life could be snuffed out by a line in a rule book. And so we continued, guided by memory, ambition, and a little bit of defiance. The boards smelled like fresh pine. The space felt like a sanctuary, and with every nail that sank into wood, I found myself more convinced. This was worth the risk. Besides, some rules in life are meant to be challenged, especially the ones trying to smother our better, braver instincts. The day the ramp went up, Bob declared it the single most impressive side project he'd taken on in years. From the vantage point of my backyard, the slow curvature of the ramp seemed to vanish into the lush canopy of leaves, giving it an otherworldly effect. I stood there, rubbing my lower back after we'd finished securing it, and I couldn't help but grin. I think Oliver's going to lose his mind when he sees this, Bob said. It's like something out of a storybook. I couldn't have agreed more. The second level, complete with a small half roof, was nearly done. We'd used good quality cedar for most of the structure, giving it that enchanting smell of a mountain cabin. Though it certainly wasn't the tallest treehouse imaginable, it was robust, boasting multiple platforms, a hidden nook I planned to pad with cushions, and enough space for at least half a dozen people if they didn't mind being a bit cozy. Construction was about 2/3 done by my estimation. We had a crew of 3 or 4 neighbors who, emboldened by the rebellious aura, had begun helping on weekends. Clara provided a steady stream of sandwiches, pies, and moral support. It started to feel less like my personal mission and more like a community operation. You wouldn't expect neighbors in a tightly controlled HOA to be so eager to help, but I think folks had grown weary of the suffocating environment. Even in small ways, they wanted to show they still had some freedom. Still, our morale had to contend with the creeping knowledge that we were being watched. On more than one occasion, we spied Martin's car parked along the curb, his silhouette visible behind the windshield. He'd linger there for half an hour, presumably snapping photos or taking notes. A couple of times, he actually got out and walked the perimeter of the yard from the sidewalk. I kept expecting him to march up with a cease and desist order, but all he did was glare through the chain-link fence, then drive away. Late one afternoon, as Bob was cleaning up the scraps of wood, Martin finally decided to approach me directly. I was on the ramp, checking the railings, when I heard him clear his throat. I turned to see him standing below, arms crossed, a crisp white shirt tucked into iron slacks, like he was auditioning for a lawyer show on TV. "Building yourself a treehouse, I see," he said, gaze sliding over the structure. "That's a big no-no in high maple acres." I took my time descending the ramp, ignoring the ache in my knees. "Afternoon, Martin. Lovely day, isn't it?" He gave me the kind of look you reserve for defiant teenagers. "We've sent you multiple notices. The board is prepared to issue daily fines. And if that doesn't stop you, we can escalate to legal channels. Did you read those letters at all?" I pressed my lips into a tight smile, nodding. "Yes, I read them. And I guess I have a different view of property rights." His nostrils flared. "You're in direct violation. At that point, Bob stepped in, leveling Martin with a calm but firm gaze. Is there anything in the bylaws that specifically bans a freestanding, elevated structure that doesn't touch the ground with a foundation? Because for what I've seen, this is hardly the typical shed-on-block situation. Martin opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly flummoxed. The treehouse's main supports were attached to the trunk and footings that were more like braces pinned under the soil rather than a standard foundation. We'd done our research. The bylaws about structures were thorough, but they mostly referred to fences, sheds, or additions to the main house. They had never accounted for a giant, multi-level treehouse. Not in such explicit terms, anyway. Well, there are other rules. The boards, the nails, the visual nuisance, Martin sputtered. We'll find a way to get you in compliance, or you'll remove this monstrosity. He glanced upward at the platforms, the glimmer of the fresh boards. Mark my words, if you don't take it down yourself, you'll regret it. With that, he spun on his heel and stomped back to his car. Bob let out a low whistle. He's not letting this go. You realize that, right? Let him try, I muttered, feeling a tremor in my stomach. Because as much as I wanted to sound brave, that man had the power to make my life miserable. Daily fines might be just the beginning. We got back to work. Over the next week, we added the finishing touches. Railings along the platforms, a solid half wall on the highest level for added safety, and the best part, a mini swinging bridge that connected the main platform to a smaller perch. This perch, Oliver's reading nook, was tucked between two enormous branches, almost hidden from below. While we hammered in the last nails, the branches swayed gently, cradling us. With the leaves shifting overhead, I caught dappled sunlight across Bob's face. He looked the happiest I'd seen him in years. Maybe it was the sense of purpose that comes from building something with your own two hands. Or maybe it was the excitement of defying the powers that be. Either way, I understood it well. I was just wiping my brow when my cell phone buzzed. It was Cynthia telling me we'd gotten another official notice, this time a thick envelope with official letterhead from a law office. The HOA had gone from threats to real legal muscle. That night, I lay awake in bed, hearing the rustle of wind through the oak's leaves just outside my window. I pictured the treehouse under the moonlight, half hidden but very real. Was it worth going toe-to-toe with the HOA's lawyers? Could they force me to tear it down, or could I drag out the legal process until a judge sympathized with my cause? I didn't have the answers, but I couldn't abandon what we'd built. It was more than just a structure now. Every railing, every plank was steeped in my memories, my efforts, and my dreams for Oliver to have a wonderland. If I let them bully me out of it, I'd never forgive myself. So I resolved to keep fighting. The next morning, I'd call a lawyer friend of mine, see if there were loopholes we could exploit. In the meantime, Bob and I would keep finishing the final touches. That treehouse was going to stand tall come what may. The legal wrangling began in earnest a few days later. I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, phone to my ear, listening to a friendly attorney named Paula walk me through the possibilities. She was the daughter of an old friend, recently out of law school and eager to take on a challenge. Well, the HOA is claiming you violated their design guidelines and building restrictions, Paula said in a measured tone. But this is a unique structure, and the guidelines are, frankly, vague on something like a treehouse paradise. We'll argue that it's more of a recreational fixture, comparable to a play set or a garden feature, rather than a separate building. It'll take time to sort out, though. Time I thought was something I had, but daily fines could pile up fast. The HOA was threatening hundreds of dollars a day, plus legal fees if I lost. Still, Paula seemed quietly confident we might at least negotiate a settlement that kept the structure intact, maybe with some modifications. I went outside to stare up at the treehouse. The ramp glowed in the late morning sun, the cedar planks radiating a warm, rich hue. Birds flitted in and out of the canopy, and a few bold squirrels dashed along the railings like they already considered it part of their domain. Up there, everything felt calm, far from the stress of official letters and legal jargon. That evening, Cynthia brewed a pot of tea and sat me down. "I know this is your dream," she said softly, "and I've supported you. But I'm worried we could lose our savings, or face a battle we can't win? I squeezed her hand. If it comes to that, I'll negotiate. But let's not surrender before we've even tested the waters. She nodded, tears in her eyes. You always were the stubborn one. It's part of why I love you. The next day, Oliver was due to arrive with his parents for a weekend visit. I couldn't wait to see the look on his face when he saw the giant treehouse. We'd promised him a surprise, but he had no idea. That morning, I dashed around cleaning the yard, sweeping sawdust, tidying the path leading to the ramp, determined to make it perfect. When their minivan pulled up, I hurried out to greet them. Oliver hopped out, a bundle of energy, and ran into my open arms. "Grandpa," he shouted, hugging me tight. "What's the surprise?" With a mischievous grin, I led him around the back of the house. As soon as he caught sight of the sprawling wooden platforms built into the oak, his jaw dropped. "No way," he breathed. "Is that for me?" "For both of us," I corrected, ruffling his hair. "But mostly for you to explore." He let out a whoop of joy and dashed to the ramp, skittering up with a nimbleness only a 10-year-old can manage. His parents trailed behind, wide-eyed, but they didn't scold me. They understood how much heart I'd poured into this. Soon enough, Oliver was clambering up to the second level, peeking over railings and exclaiming over the little reading nook. I showed him the rope ladder, the crow's nest, and the small table I'd placed near the trunk for card games. The grin never left his face, and I felt a lump in my throat, overwhelmed by the knowledge that for this moment, it was all worth it. We spent most of that afternoon in the treehouse, ignoring the ominous fact that Martin's car had slowed to a crawl in front of my house. Again, probably snapping photos of the joyous scene. Let him see, I thought. Let him see the simple happiness he was trying to thwart. But the following morning, my phone rang at sunrise. It was Paula telling me the HOA had filed an injunction, an emergency motion to stop all use of the illegal structure. They were trying to force me to dismantle it immediately, claiming it posed grave safety risks to the community. No mention of all the safety measures I'd taken, no acknowledgement that I had used professional-grade materials, just that it was a danger. I felt the blood drain from my face. Oliver was still sleeping, tired from a night of climbing up and down the platforms. Cynthia stared at me with concern as I told her what Paula had said. "We'll challenge it," she promised. "Don't lose hope." The hearing was set for 3 days later. I was a bundle of nerves, but in the meantime, I refused to ban Oliver from the treehouse. I just made him wear a safety harness if he wanted to climb to the highest parts, strictly to avoid any chance of an accident. Bob came by, too, to show Oliver how we'd reinforce the beams. It was like a living classroom in engineering and construction. The childlike spark in Bob's eyes told me that building this had ignited something in him, too, a sense of wonder he'd thought lost the time. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in a clean button-down shirt, slacks, and a tie. Cynthia insisted on coming with me for moral support. Paula met us at the county courthouse, a binder full of documents in hand. We stepped into a cramped conference room with a mediator, Martin, and a lawyer representing the HOA. Tension crackled in the air. Martin's face was set in stone. I watched his lawyer lay out reasons the structure violated community rules. He had color photos that showed the visual blight of a large wooden fixture rising above fence lines, allegations that it could cause property devaluation, and a repeated claim that it wasn't just a children's playset, but a multi-level building with occupancy. Paula countered with the argument that the bylaws didn't forbid tree houses specifically, and that many homes in the neighborhood had elaborate playsets. She pointed out structural documentation from Bob, who was a certified contractor. She even brought testimonies from neighbors who supported it. We must have spent hours going back and forth. At one point, Martin lost his cool. "This is a community of rules. If we let him get away with this, who knows what other monstrosities people will build? A chicken coop? A goat shed? We have standards for a reason." That's when I spoke up. My voice trembled slightly, but I refused to be cowed. "I serve on the local volunteer fire department for 25 years, I said, looking Martin in the eyes. "I've always followed the law, paid my dues, and kept my property neat. All I wanted was to build something that sparks imagination for my grandson, and maybe for other neighbors too." I'm not trying to degrade the community. I'm trying to enrich it. And if the HOA's rules don't allow for that, maybe the rules need to be revisited. Silence descended. Even Martin's lawyer cast him a sidelong glance. Finally, the mediator cleared her throat. It seems there may be a compromise here. The structure is built. Perhaps it can remain with certain conditions, added inspections, signed waivers, or a height limit for future expansions. Over the next hour, we hammered out a tentative agreement. I would cover a one-time fee for a retroactive permit, show proof that it was safe, and ensure my liability insurance covered potential accidents on the property. In exchange, the HOA would drop the injunction and daily fines. It was a reluctant acceptance on their part, but enough neighbors had quietly voiced support that the board didn't want a full-scale neighborhood revolt. Martin left in a huff, but I couldn't stop smiling. When it was all said and done, Paula gave me a congratulatory pat on the shoulder. It's not an outright victory, but you get to keep your treehouse. I call that a win. I nearly teared up. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. 3 days later, I was back in my yard, climbing the ramp with Oliver, who had a brand new journal he wanted to fill with sketches of birds and squirrels. The setting sun filtered through the leaves, painting the wooden planks in a soft glow. I glanced out across the neighborhood, noticing a few silhouettes in windows. Some might be supporters, some might be watchers. But none of that mattered now. I'd built my giant treehouse paradise, and for the most part, it was here to stay. In the quiet hush of the twilight, as Oliver chattered about all the imaginary tree kingdoms he was going to create, I felt a surge of gratitude. Gratitude for second chances, for a community that could rally behind something joyous, and for the sturdy old oak that let us build our dreams in its branches. Sure, there would be more compromise ahead. Annual inspections, some aesthetic guidelines, maybe a limit on just how many wind chimes and lanterns I could add. But I could live with that. In the end, I'd stood up for something I believed in, and I discovered that sometimes life's best moments happen when you dare to defy the limits imposed on you. I told Oliver to be careful near the edge, and he waved me off with the confidence only a child can have. "Grandpa, it's our treehouse," he said, beaming. "Nothing bad's gonna happen here." I smiled, gazing at the sturdy railings and the thick trunk that had weathered storms far fiercer than any legal challenge. Maybe he was right. Maybe in this lofty hideaway, we were untouchable, even if only for an afternoon at a time. And that was all I needed. A place to dream with my grandson, safe among the leaves, free from the constraints of a world too often ruled by paperwork and petty rules. At least up here in my giant treehouse paradise, we'd reclaimed a spark of childlike wonder, one the HOA couldn't snuff out with a letter. The end.